second installment of our conversations about philosophy and how it connects to our life, our everyday lives.
Yeah.
How are you doing, Monica?
I'm good. It's cold
Dr.
here.
Vilhauer. Excuse me, Dr. Vilhauer.
Oh, it's
How
cool. You
are
can call me Monica. But yeah, it's a cold day here in Portland, Oregon, and I assume they're in New York as well.
Mm-hmm.
But we're going to talk a little bit about philosophical counseling today as one of the ways of, one of the modes of doing practical philosophy. And just to kind of remind us of where we were last time, we were talking about how philosophy can get into some of these big questions about what is the meaning and purpose of my life, or who am I really? Who do I want to be? How do I live an authentic life that is really my own and not just someone else's expectation of me?
Yeah.
How do I become more empowered? How do I deal with uncertainty and change and loss and death and these kinds of things, alienation, injustice in the world? So these are real life, real world problems that philosophy can deal with.
Yeah, and I think I was, chomping at the bit last time, wanting to talk more about counseling. I think because of how very different it is and how much it is something that is really useful. It's really, I think, instrumental in providing a cathartic experience for people if it only had a little bit better of a kind of cultural understanding. I think if people understood what it could do or what it makes it so potent, I think that's where we're doing this. But I'm very eager to talk more about this specifically. So how does that work? How does the work of philosophical counseling go?
Yeah. So, I mean, even though we're eventually getting into these big existential and ethical questions that I mentioned, we're doing it in a pretty natural way. We start by me asking the client to just sort of talk about what they're struggling with. And I, listen to their story and I ask a lot of questions. And then we get to a point where we can start to sort of group some of the issues and try to articulate what the philosophical questions or problems are that are related to the struggles that they're having. And we might come up with some initial, answers to those philosophical questions that kind of reveal like what the operating assumptions are, the operating values are that are going on behind the scenes, so we can get them get those assumptions out in front of us to look at them and examine them, see if they've got, conflicts within them or they're too narrow or something, and then we can compare them with other insights, either from the history of philosophy or ones we come up from our life experience and that kind of thing. So I mean, that's kind of an abstract way of putting it, but so maybe I would say more of how I see my role, is really not as a lecturer or a teacher or a doctor or anything like that.
Not coming up the mountain and so that you can impart the wisdom.
I'm not bestowing, things. I'm a friend. I'm a partner in this journey, co-pilot or something, in this journey of existential and ethical questions. And I really do see my role as philosophical friend. And when we talk next time, I'll say a little bit more about how that's rooted in some of the philosophies that I studied when I was specializing in academic areas. But I think that talking to a philosophical counselor is like talking to a good friend who's, not trying to project their own agenda on you. They want to help you figure out what's going to be best for you and how to create it in practice. Someone to investigate and deliberate with you, someone to get in the trenches of the struggles and confusions with you. But this philosophical friend, is a unique and kind of a weirdo friend because they're pretty nerdy. They've studied a lot of philosophy. They have a lot of insights from the history of philosophy to bring to the table, to kind of help open up thinking. So they have a lot to contribute in the way of different like wisdom traditions.
That's a very deeply Aristotelian root in that, right? This idea of like friendship even being stronger than the bonds of citizenship, right? So this idea that there's this kind of, intellectual partnering that you do, that improves the condition of one's life and maybe one's eudaimonia, right? The ability for one to get closer to being their best selves and having a relationship to the world that is really law making and not simply law abiding. You're not simply just living according to custom and a lot of what you got used to. And I think a lot of us are in survival pandemic conditions, getting used to a lot of things. And as much as we might have had a lot of comforts, now we're adapting to a lot of discomforts. But and friendships can work around that, right? So you maintain some friendships. I think there's just an article out now about, was it The Atlantic? They were talking about how our friendships are changing with being online friendships and how some of them are falling away. But I think there's something really important about maintaining this idea that philosophy has this quality of companionship or friendship that's unique to the work.
Like when we're in a counseling session, we're there to work on the client's struggles, which sometimes really overlap with the counselor's struggles. And in those cases, there can be a really interesting joint inquiry going on. And I don't, though I don't turn the conversation around to be about me, I will, offer personal experience, especially if it helps to the other person to know they're not alone in their struggles, and that I've struggled with similar things.
I think that's also really important for the profession of philosophy, because stylistically, I think the idea of the lecturer, the wisdom bearer imparting the wisdom, has a very masculinist tradition. But I do think that when you in some ways springboard off of your own experience, you have a kind of level of honesty. It's not a facade of judgment that entitles you in some way. I think that too stylistically has this quality of being arguably feminist in its philosophical.
Well, and there's empathy involved in that. You're relating things to your own experience. You're helping. You're sometimes giving, bringing in ideas that, from ways that you've tried to answer these questions, or ways that you've tried to overcome similar struggles. So, again, your philosophy friend, counselor is a friend, but kind of a funny friend in some ways, because of the way they bring lots of insights from the history of philosophy into the conversation, but also in the way that they want to spend extra time uncovering assumptions and beliefs and values, and really examining them, and the way they are good at recognizing contradictions, and take time to ask what is not just how you feel, but what is true, and what is good, and what is fair, and what's worth striving for, and these kinds of.
See, that does not that doesn't seem like a weird friend kind of thing.
That sounds like a good friend.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Like, it sounds like a really unique resource that anybody could be in need of, and just not realize that this is out there, that this kind of.
It's just an unusual friend. It's hard to find friends like that, I think.
Right.
You'll have to talk to a philosophical counselor to get their style, I think, a little bit. But I just think that we can talk about life problems and speak and think philosophically without having to cite a bunch of texts.
Right.
I mean, I do bring in insights from different philosophers that I've studied, and I may or may not get deeply into where that came from and who said it and what the different interpretations of it. I mean, it's just not as relevant to the person's problems that we're dealing with. And, if people do want to study philosophy and study texts and dig into them and see how they apply to life, I have workshops where I do that at Curious Soul Philosophy. But this, in a workshop, we start with the text. In counseling, we start with the person's problems, and we bring insights to them as they become relevant.
I think that's a really nice thing about you work as the editor and the archive for the person in real time so that they don't have to go back. I think when we were in the classroom, that's expected. We're helping you through a text. We're helping you get your own archive of philosophical, insights. But you kind of come with, okay, let's all this stuff that I have, all the work that I've done, I'm able to be at your disposal in terms of pulling up what might be the most handy for you to, trouble the problem that you're in or complicate it in order to then also get a better understanding of it. And I think that's also what's nice about kind of philosophical counseling is complexity and not having everything resolved in some kind of way is not part of the goal. That's why you might not use that word, because I think when we think of goal, we think of finish line. Ta-da! And I think with philosophical problems, the complexity is its own exercise.
Yeah, well, we're working through
some of it.
Yeah, we're working through things together, and that is a kind of end in itself. Also, I was going to say that sometimes the best philosophical insights aren't from some book. They're from the ones you have in the moment, in the conversation with the other, that emerge, kind of out of nowhere, or from your own critical and creative thinking with the other person. And you're not going to find them in some book somewhere. And those are just as worthwhile as philosophical insights.
I think I'd said something similar too about, being an ethicist, even to some degree being an artist, how useful I can be, but that people don't take me up on my usefulness. We don't see a lot of that cultural currency. So, 2020 being the, I want to say cluster F that it was. So I'm sure that people, especially with specific kind of ways in which the multiple crises, the multiple ways in which the year unfolded, I'm sure that a philosophical counselor would have a way of, navigating that differently than, let's say, a therapist or even an ethicist, for that matter, specifically, in terms of ethical argument.
Well, yeah, I mean, some of the big crises of 2020, philosophical crises of 2020, touch on, the how to deal with so much uncertainty and chaos. That's one. Stoics are very, that is really their question that they focus a lot on too. And then, finding meaning in a world that seems like it's totally upside down, like your usual compass of meaning is just all off and you don't know where the meaning is. That's another big one. Isolation and loneliness, big crisis in 2020, and anger and exhaustion at injustice and untruth and division. Those are big ones. This existential insight that meaning isn't just delivered to you from the universe, it's something that you have to create. And so you find yourself in this situation where your freedom seems rather restricted, and how can you find meaning in this situation? And I think Viktor Frankl is very good at these very helpful in thinking about how even in the worst of times or the bleakest of times, we can still find meaning in work that we do, or creative activities, or relationships, or the beauty of the sunrise, or beauty of a song, or something like that, or even in the way we bear our suffering, there's meaning in that. So that's been coming up a lot too. I mean, we could talk about more things too, but that's just gets you started. Philosophical counselors aren't pathologizing their clients, and I think that that's maybe a nice segue into some differences between philosophical counseling and psychotherapy. And I mean, I do think that there are types of psychotherapy that are very close to philosophical counseling because they're drawing on the same philosophical traditions and existentialism and stoicism, that kind of thing. But it is sometimes quite different. And I mean, one thing that's quite different is philosophical counseling is kind of radically unhierarchical. I'm not a doctor. I'm not diagnosing you. I'm not
Not a
pathologizing your
medical
struggle.
doctor. Not a
I'm not a medical
academic
doctor.
doctor all the way.
Yeah. But I'm not, pulling rank here. I don't have some, secret map of your psyche or some secret notion of where you should get in this process or what the destination should be. And I'm just kind of baiting you along, like putting down little breadcrumbs until you get there. No, that's not how it is. I mean, I'm working without a map just like you, we're struggling together. And these existential struggles and ethical struggles, identity struggles, I don't see those as pathologies. I see them as very human questions, springing from the human condition. And so I don't diagnose, and I'm struggling with these age-old questions along with you. Just some other things, like I think that there are a lot of psychotherapeutic there's a psychotherapeutic tradition that is very almost completely focused on asking questions about how you feel and how you feel about how you feel, and then how do you feel about that. And I think that some people might be pleasantly surprised that the philosopher is going to jump to, well, why do you feel that way? Is that true? They'll start to ask questions about truth and what is good,
Yes.
what is fair, just. So it's not just the sphere of feelings, though feelings are important. The way we feel, we talked about this last time, is very connected to the way we think. We might have to examine the way we think, and that might have a big effect on the way we feel. So, I mean, I think for a philosopher, thinking critically about what is true, what is good, what is fair is just as important for our well-being, if not more important for our well-being than just questions about how we feel.
Yeah. I think also what's nice too about philosophy and how very different it is than the field in psychotherapy and psychology is, we have philosophy of emotions. It's not like philosophers aren't thinking about the function of rage or the importance of empathy. And so I think the misperception is that we are always rational and we are unemotional and
I mean, Aristotle's
aloof.
ethics is all about
Right,
what's the right amount of,
right. And
of different emotions.
and I think when I would do a self-examination of ableism, when I'd have students kind of unpack maybe how they're clinging on to some aspects of ableist bias, I would have them do an emotional inventory of an experience they had with disability when they were young and how they internalized that memory, and then examine or reflect upon their emotional state now, having learned a little bit about how deeply biased we are as a society and harmful toward the value of disabled lives and disabled knowledge. And the emotional inventory was always so interesting because as I took them through it, I wasn't trying to have them just emote. It really was about examining in a very individualized or a very self-directed way what those feelings told them or how
Yeah.
they indicated where they were in the world and how they perceived it in terms of a kind of fairness, right? And a kind
Yeah.
of
Well, like
sense of it.
what happens when you realize that the personal is political? The
And
the
yeah,
feeling of self-loathing that you're the one to blame for, your difficulty of adapting to the situation of the world, that self-loathing suddenly changes. Oh, wait a minute. There's something wrong with the world, not just with me, things change.
I think that was also one of the insights that I got from doing things from a disability studies perspective, a critical disability studies perspective, was freeing oneself from the shame, blame economy, that somehow most of my emotions were somehow in that currency, and that I had to negotiate my way or up talk my way out of it. And that was too much work. Sometimes it's too much work to not try to blame myself or take responsibility for things that I couldn't possibly in my being take responsibility for. But again, the exercise of being able to kind of organize one's relationship to one's feelings, to one's experiences, to one's thinking, right? Those internal scripts, I think is really important labor that needs a guidepost and a guider, a counselor
Yeah.
to walk through. I think that's
And I
also
need it too. I mean, when I'm stuck in my own scripts, I need an outside voice to work with me too. I mean,
that's why we have friendships.
And this is why we need philosophical friendships. Exactly.
Speaking of which, I mean, we talk as directly as you want about it, because I think that was one of the things that persuaded me about how much we really do need to do more, not promotion, but just more literacy for like what philosophical counseling is about, is how by being counseled philosophically when I lost my job, I think it was in terms of timing, I didn't realize how much of a resource it was at the time. Looking back, I realized, wow, I'm so glad I was doing it at that time, because I think I was finding myself in a bit of a hole and just digging in further. And I didn't realize I was doing it. I didn't realize how dug in I was with the state of affairs in a way that was so deeply personal and yet so not necessary. It was definitely engaged in a kind of self-harm, not in the sense of again, a psychological self-harm, but in a kind of existential self-harm. I just really didn't take myself out of myself enough to be able to give myself a breath. I was not generous to myself in any kind of way. And in talking with you and doing some sessions, I think that's when we really started to work on this idea of meaningful work as like this really lovely concept that I ended up writing about, because it became a little bit of a life raft in the muck. And so I'm grateful for that, but I also think that that's why I'm personally very interested in building a little bit more of a basic, like, philosophical counseling 101. What is this? What can one do with it?
Yeah. Using philosophical counseling, for instance, in the example of losing a job and feeling the devastation of maybe even your career being over. It's not a job that's easily transferable somewhere else. Your career being over, your identity being crushed, your sense of self-esteem being lost. And, some things that philosophical counseling helped with, I think, and Jen can, say more, but for instance, asking the question, what is our identity based on? We have this real cultural pressure or tendency to base our identity on our job alone. Our professional identity is our identity. And we asked questions about whether that's true, whether that's too narrow of a notion of identity, what are some other ways to think about identity. Same with value. We have this, very capitalist tendency, pressure to think of our value as just our market value. Mm-hmm. What other people think our value is based on the profit they can make from us. It's like, and we know, and Jen and I both know rationally that our value is much broader than that.
Yeah.
But it's so easy to slip into that belief when it's the air we breathe in this culture, And then when you lose your value as a professional, seems that no one wants to use you anymore to make profit off of your back anymore, then what am I? I'm nothing. I'm worth nothing. We talked a lot about, what your value can be based on beyond your job. And I think that kind of helped open up self-esteem again. Jen has a couple of lovely children and is a very talented artist, and also is someone who can write and philosophize beyond the walls of her university. And, things like that maybe helped open up a broader view of what you could try next.
Yeah. I think putting language on what one can't say or one doesn't have language for too. Again, thinking of that Frankel method, something very much in that tradition. And I think psychotherapy shares that tradition, which is trying to help someone, pull things that have a kind of non-language that can't be said out into a process of examination in order to free the person of the kinds of traps. And I think at one point, being able to be talking about my experience as a kind of shipwreck was really helpful, because then it was less about what I could have done or what I didn't do or the resentments that came with what had come to pass. It really was kind of, all right, the fact of it.
Yeah, it's a situation in which you find yourself.
Right. And that there's a certain amount of wreckage that just I'd have to decide when I would be ready to start. And would I want to rebuild a ship? Do I want to rebuild, or do
the
I
same
want,
ship?
Right. Or do I want to try some other course to direct myself? And again, I think for someone who is very invested in the life that they lead right now, and then to find that interrupted, again, trauma is something so individuated and so specific to the person who experiences it, and creates such an event that has no like outward external marker. Philosophical counseling can be just an important tool. And I think that's why I wrote a graphic novel on miscarriage, but also a whole like phenomenological examination of miscarriage, because it was one of those things that was like, I was grieving a kind of death, but it wasn't a death and it wasn't recognized. People wanted me to move on. And so I had to like build a little architecture of language around that phenomena so that it could be meaningful, even if it wasn't uplifting in like a Hallmark card version. I definitely talked about pregnancy in a very negative way, because I was talking about it from a perspective of a miscarry. What happens when you're pregnant and there's nothing in the end. But by creating this architecture, and I did this on my own, but I found that now that I have it, when I do talk to people who either have the experience or are philosophically trained in things like, embodiment and gender, that it's a useful architecture. And it was done kind of similar to like what you do after a shipwreck. You're kind of like modifying and maybe even reinventing a lot of things that you took for granted before about what you thought you were doing on that ship. And so I think philosophical counseling gives a kind of toolkit that you can't rebuild sometimes from certain events or certain kinds of experiences without that like new tool. Like you might have your hammer, you might have your screwdriver, but wouldn't it be nice to have a chainsaw, something like that, And I think that's also what makes it could be complementary to something like traditional therapy, and not necessarily in lieu of or anything like that.
Yeah.
Like you said,
I also think
it's not that's not what you're doing, and at no point do you posture a kind of replacement or substitute for.
No, I mean, I have clients who also see psychologists and me, because we have different angles on the problems, and we can delve into them in different ways. Yeah, I was also just going to say, whereas traditional psychotherapy tends to be very retrospective, philosophical counseling is very prospective. So we're looking ahead. How do we build the ship anew after a shipwreck? How do we build a different ship? How do we decide what kind of different ship we want to build? What are the avenues open to us that we never saw before? So it's really, I mean, so much of lately I've been thinking that so much of the conversations I have with people have to do with broadening our thinking and kind of breaking the old narrow patterns of the grooves in which we're used to habitually thinking about things. And kind of doing some paradigm shifts or doing some reframing, opening the field of vision, of thought, of opportunity, of options in a new way. I feel like so much of that is what people need, and I need it too. I mean, I get very stuck in my own grooves of thinking too. Like, okay, yeah, I have a PhD in philosophy. What am I going to do besides teach? Well, maybe there are some other things I could do, and maybe I will create those other things if they do not exist yet.
Yeah.
See what happens.
And philosophers are well versed in the concept of despair. Despair is a familiar friend when you are a student of philosophy, and I think it's maybe an occupational hazard that comes with.
But it's not scary.
That kind of
It's
work.
not scary. It's familiar. Like, as you said, I think, yeah, a lot of people who talk to me, they have issues that they want to talk to about that their friends find frightening. It's too much, and then they worry they can't just, okay, we're dealing with some crises here. Like, okay, like, I'm not going to tell you to stop worrying or stop talking about it because it's unpleasant for me. I can handle all kinds of unpleasantness. I'm very familiar with unpleasantness.
Yeah.
And
The philosophical honesty, right? So that we don't dress things up, we don't costume. And I think there has been a certain kind of pop psychology aspect to that, where it is a kind of costuming, that there's like, canned responses to certain kinds of issues or dilemmas. And I think that's what is good about a philosophical tradition, is we kind of see the uniqueness in each individual's experience of despair. That um, Levinas, the ethicist, the philosopher that I do, I mentioned it last time, says every death is a scandal in being. It's important to be able to allow that to be true in one's worldview, because I think we are surrounded by so much that is potentially traumatizing or so demanding and so despairing. Especially, I think I went over the world calculator for COVID with my students yesterday, and I think it's hard to wrap your head around. It is an event of mass death.
yeah. And how do we
And
cope with it without turning away from it?
and that's where philosophers can do a bit of are well choreographed in how to possibly navigate that honestly, and not dress it up, and not kind of try mindful techniques that allow you to kind of um, just meditate, or to withdraw from the rigor of having to reconcile many things that are potentially despair inducing and difficult to stomach. Um, and again, not necessarily like you get used to it. I don't think any of us get used to things that are despair inducing, or especially, I think, philosophers who are in this friendship tradition and aren't in the tradition of argumentation. There are some really great philosophers that know how to persuade with the best of skill. But I think if you are in a tradition of philosophical friendship, being able to acknowledge the depth of how important a despairing event or a difficult problem is, and that acknowledgement alone, that acceptance, is so valuable, because I think a lot of
And
people
that
ask us to move on.
it
They
also, it
ask to move
opens
on.
up truth in a new way. I mean, your experience with the miscarriage opened up a new truth about pregnancy that really was not being recognized, and yet is it like 1 in 3 women experience it or so? I don't know. It's like some big statistic. I can't remember. You know better than me.
Yeah.
But it's something very broadly experienced, and yet a truth that is never recognized. And so people have to live it in the dark, you know,
Right.
and putting a language to it, accepting and opening up that truth, so that people don't feel alone in it, or can finally, start to try to cope with it. That's a truth born of a despairing experience, and so it's can be very productive, even if it's difficult.
I think too, just one other component of this that I think is really important about how philosophy is a working tool is that it also allows you that doxic function, this idea that your those very deeply attached opinions, you can also abandon those. That, part of that miscarriage experience was that, I was going to have a kid, or I was going to have a baby. Like, I had to abandon that possibility or that assumption when I lost my job. Again, not from any fault of my own, but that now I was a teacher with no students, or a professor with no classroom. That that uh, attachment to that, doxa, that idea or opinion, um, being able to put it down and abandon it or unlearn the script, I think is also where philosophers become very useful in one's thinking and freeing oneself.
Yeah.
Because, and I think we do this in the classroom. This is where the classroom, I think, is very similar to a philosophical counseling exercise, is that you get to also kind of unlearn what you inherited. A lot of the mistakes or advice that we were told along the way. Um, Even when they've come from the best of intentions, well-intended people in our lives who mean well and who have said things to us that we've internalized as a true opinion, right? And again, that Socratic element of counseling is to kind of say, well, what makes this opinion so true? Is there any real kind of bearing on the being of things? Or is it just something simply inherited that has the appearance of truth? And I think that's also nice about what we can do as a pedagogy, but also in a practical sense for people in real time. This idea that we have a kind of midwifery work to do, that we really do help bring things into the world that otherwise wouldn't exist.
That's a nice sentiment to end on, I think. You have good final
So what are we doing
words. The
next
last
time?
what's
next time? What's
next time
on the
we are
horizon?
next time we are going to talk a little bit about the way my academic focus in the philosopher Gadamer, who's interested in how interpretation and dialogue works, how understanding between people works, and what the ethical dimensions of that communication are. We're going to be talking a little bit about how I'm using some of my academic work in philosophical counseling, and how I found a new home for some of the academic work that I've done. So we're going to be talking about dialogue and friendship and the concept of play and playfulness. And how those.
Can I just sidebar? I'm going to
Yeah.
sidebar because
Okay.
this is what also, again, comes from a longstanding friendship. But I designed an entire first year seminar course around Monica's work, called Theories of Play. And it culminated in us reading on your work on dialogue and play, and how really important it was, especially for first-time students, a lot of first-generation college students where I taught. And it was a really, I so enjoyed building that syllabus, and I had other people teaching it as well, because what it did is it kind of started from the beginning in terms of what counts as play and how much we've changed the culture of playfulness and dialogue and engagement, and turned it into this stuff of capitalism, right? The stuff of markets. And so much of them had gone into the college experience with such high risk expectations about careers and majors and work and debt and money. So trying to have them see something like their college experience as an adventure, as an engagement that is meant to be like one is in play, like one is in a state of play, and how very freeing it should be as an exercise, and enjoyable, like the pleasure of college, not the partying of college. That was a different thing, but the pleasure, the deep pleasure of being among people who are, a work in progress, and how that should be where the risk is, and not in this idea that, like, if I don't get these grades and if I don't graduate, I won't be able to pay off the debt and I won't have
Yeah. And what
I
does
think
it
there's
mean?
still a lot of that.
Like, what does it mean to be so engaged in the conversation of your education that and so lost in the play of learning, that it feels, I mean, it of course it's hard work in a lot of ways, but it's also this total engagement that is a kind of lightness, and it has a life of its own. And so we'll talk about, what does it mean for genuine dialogue, which is playful and also has friendship built into it. What does it mean to use that as a model for philosophical counseling? That's what I'm thinking a lot about these days.
So until next time.
Okay, until
See you
next
then.
time. Bye, Jen.
For more on Monica's work, see Curious Soul Philosophy. She holds workshops, retreats, and counseling sessions. My work on addressing ableism is with Lexington Books 2017. Thank you so much for watching.